Hi guys, Goffy here and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about my Leica M11. I crunched the numbers the other day and realized that today is my 500th day with this camera. I think that just about counts as a long-term review, and in today's video, I want to talk about the good and the bad. Spoiler alert, I wouldn't have used a camera for 500 days if I didn't like it, but there are definitely some cons to this camera too, including the fact that I do think this camera contributed to my channel taking a bit of a plunge last year. We'll talk about that towards the end. But let's kick off then with the good things about this camera. Now, when it comes to the good things about this camera, there are two things for me that stand out by an absolute country mile. The first one of those is image quality. Now, this is a camera that requires you to do all of the heavy lifting and get it right, but if you do get it right, when you sit down and edit the images, they genuinely do look incredible. Obviously, Leica have a very nice set of lenses as well, which helps with the whole image quality thing, but honestly, the files that come out of this camera when you get it right do look great. The only camera that I have used I think competes with the files that I'm seeing is the GFX line of cameras. I used the GFX 100S a few times over the last few years, and it's only when I edit them files that I think I've ever found myself thinking, you know what, maybe these are better than the Leica ones. The second and probably most obvious thing about this camera, and the reason I shoot these cameras in the first place, is the whole rangefinder experience. I absolutely love using a rangefinder, manual focus. That whole kind of ethos of taking photos is one of the things that I fell in love with a few years ago. If you don't like manual focus lenses or you don't like a rangefinder, then this camera isn't going to be for you. And that should be pretty obvious, but that is definitely the case. For me, this photography thing that I do is mainly for fun and enjoyment. And for me, a rangefinder is definitely part of that enjoyment. Another thing that I love about this camera that maybe is not quite so important is the battery life. The battery life is insane. Taking out some of my other Fuji cameras like the X100V and the X Pro 2, I need to think to myself, take multiple batteries for a full day trip. With this thing, that's just not even a consideration. One battery on a full charge will easily last me a full day out shooting. I don't need to remember to take a second battery. Another thing that is quite unique to this camera when it came out, but more manufacturers are starting to do it, is putting memory in the camera. I don't know why other camera brands have taken so long to do this, but it is seemingly starting to become a pretty normal thing. Not having to always remember that I need a memory card has been a big win. I'm a little bit forgetful, and there is a bit of a running joke in the family as well. Whenever I go out on my camera, people are always like, hey, have you got your SD card? Because I was known to forget them. I'd stick them in my computer, take the images off, and never put it back in my camera. That has happened to me a few times with this camera. But importantly, it has a little bit of internal memory, which means I can just take images and save them internally. Something that did annoy me when I first picked up this camera was the removal of the base plate. I worried about how, especially because it doesn't have a sticker on the bottom, it was gonna wear, and honestly, it has worn very well. There's like no marks on it at all. The only bit that is getting marks is the battery, and I do wonder if that's just where they're using a slightly worse material for the battery cap than they are at the end. But having more recently picked up a Leica M10 mono, which had the base plate on it again, I've remembered how annoying it is going back to the base plate. Going from the base plate to this, it felt like maybe it was losing a little bit of its magic. Having gone from this back to having a camera with a base plate, it's just worse in like every way. Being able to pop the battery out and get to your memory card in seconds, as opposed to having to quite literally take the thing off, is a big win. And USB-C charging has also been surprisingly helpful in the few occasions that I have wanted to charge this camera with just my phone charger, which, yeah, is something that other M cameras couldn't do, but other cameras have been able to do for years. Now, a lot of people talk about Leica cameras for having really good manual controls. And I don't disagree, but I do think something that Leica do very well that some other manufacturers are still struggling with is actually having a really good user interface. The touchscreen on this camera, for me, I always assumed was going to be a bit of a gimmick because most of my other previous cameras didn't have a touchscreen, so therefore I was so used to using buttons that having a touchscreen was just a bit gimmicky. Having actually used the Leica user interface that seems very, very well done for touchscreen, I actually really like it. Now, I do think Leica do have a bit of an advantage because they have just less options in general, but the options that they do have are very well organized on this screen on the back. And just having most of the things I need on a touch control is something that I actually found myself using way more than I'd ever imagined I would. And something I didn't expect is I'm pretty sure whenever I'm out in London, less people notice this one than the black one, which I know seems really counterintuitive, but it's definitely been my experience. Whenever I had my black M10 walking around London, it felt like it got noticed a lot. Now I've got this silver M11, I feel like generally the camera just gets noticed far less. So let's jump into the bad things. There are a few of them, and the first one for me, specifically with the M cameras, is weather sealing. Now, Leica are a company that on their SL and their Q line of cameras go as far as giving them IP ratings and talking about it in just about all of their promo material. But arguably on their flagship M cameras, they're a little bit shy about saying that these cameras are weather sealed. I think a lot of it is to do with the mount and the fact that the M lenses don't have gaskets on them, which basically means it's never weather sealed. Now I have used this camera in light rain, but whenever the rain gets a little bit heavy, I do find myself putting this camera away and wishing maybe I had a camera that was rated as being weather sealed. There is another time that I find myself putting this camera away, and that is just in situations where I think the camera is at risk of theft or me being a bit of a target. Now, ultimately, these cameras are insured. It's not the monetary value that is worrying me. It's more about being a target for that sort of thing. Another one of the downsides is file sizes. Now, I thought when I first picked up this camera, I would absolutely love the feature where you can go through 3 different megapixel sizes on RAW files. And in my head, I thought, whenever I'm shooting casually with friends and family, I'll stick it to 18. Whenever I'm shooting like landscapes, I'll go up to 60. And most of the time, I'll just set it on the 36 or 32 megapixel option. The reality is, mentally, I struggle to shoot anything that's not 60. Because every time you're changing it from 60 down to 36 or 18, you are basically choosing to take worse images. And you never know when a great image is going to come along. So what I end up is with this little mental battle of thinking, well, why would I willingly turn down my image quality? So I leave it on 60 megapixels the whole time, which wouldn't be so much of a problem if my storage solution for my images wasn't cloud storage. I use the cloud version of Lightroom, and I've recently had to upgrade that now to the 3 terabyte version, which I think is £35 a month. Then another one of the downsides is the thing that makes it what it is, the fact that this camera has a rangefinder and no autofocus. There are certain situations where you find yourself wanting an EVF and autofocus, and the reality is that for me, that is some of the time. Therefore, I've always ensured that I do have another camera that goes alongside this one, be it the FX30 or the XH2S or even just the X100V. If you have this as your only camera, and I had the M240 as my only camera, because of its shortcomings, I did begin to resent it a little bit because I didn't have an alternative. I do think having an alternative does make your enjoyment of this camera better because you then can focus on what makes this thing good. There is also with this camera specifically the freezing problem. A lot of people have these cameras freeze on them all of the time. I have been exceptionally lucky that I have barely experienced freezing at all. It does freeze on me. I think it's probably frozen maybe 10 times now in my ownership. And the good thing is now with the base plate is you can fix that problem really quickly by popping the battery out. It is annoying, and I have been exceptionally lucky compared to some of my friends out there that I know have had some very big issues when it comes to freezing. Another one of the downsides as well is obviously the price of this camera, right? It's an expensive camera, but we're going to assume that you want to get into Leica anyway, so you're willing to accept that the entry price is going to be higher than normal. I do think that means that the best value for money Leica camera at the minute isn't this. I do think it's the M10. The M240 is noticeably worse than the M10 in just about every way, and that price difference over time has closed right up. You don't need to spend that much more to get an M10 now over an M240. However, the gap between the M10 and the M11 is still pretty vast. And for that, you are getting more megapixels and a lot of creature comforts, but I do think that price gap, which here I think is about £2,000 still, it's just not worth it in terms of value. I have zero regrets upgrading because things like the better battery life and the lack of base plate and all of that stuff is great. However, from a value proposition point of view, for me, the M10 is the answer. And if anyone ever asks me what M camera that should they get that's digital, the M10 seems to be my default choice. And then I think for my final dislike, let's talk about that magenta shift. These cameras are known for having a bit of a cold magenta look to the files straight out of camera. The raw files for me, especially compared to my preference of warm images, are just not that great. But in reality, all this really meant for me was I went to my presets and I edited them ever so slightly to have a little bit more warmth and a little bit more green in them, and that was that. It doesn't cause me a problem at all what the raw files look like coming out of this camera, because I'm gonna edit them all anyway. That's why I shot raw. A little tweak to my presets that took minutes means that magenta cast just doesn't cause me a problem anymore today. I had what I thought was quite an interesting thought the other day about how tools in most creative fields kind of never change. If you play the guitar, then guitars are a guitar. Things do change slightly, but ultimately, if you get good at using a guitar will always be a guitar. It's the same with, like, if you're a writer, maybe you have a preference over like a fountain pen. And you can be safe in the knowledge that if you learn how to use a fountain pens will always be there. Because nothing can really change because they're kind of locked in. And then you get to photography, and it's something that advancements just seem to just keep on coming. They absolutely fly at you, and to some extent, you do feel like you need to keep up. And because of that, our tools feel kind of disposable to some extent. But if you're an artist or someone who plays the guitar, you're not constantly thinking about, oh, I'm going to ditch my fancy fountain pen, or it's time to bin the guitar now because a new fancy one come out. Instead, you start to learn your tool. And I think when it comes to photography, an M camera is the only thing I've owned that I think I'll own for the rest of my life, from that same sort of perspective of, this has everything I could ever want. Now, don't get me wrong, if new sensors come out in the future, I will upgrade this to the next iteration, but at the same time, the fundamentals are likely to never really change with this camera. And in photography, it's something that's pretty rare. This is my creative tool of choice, and it's a tool that hasn't really changed that much in like 60, 70, 80 years. And for that, I'm actually super thankful. And I think to some extent, that is why so many people love these cameras, is because it feels like you're learning something that is a tool that you can arguably just use forever. It will be transferable for the next who knows how long. It's not like picking up many other cameras where you learn them for a bit, then you're moving on to the next tech advancement. Instead, things are much slower paced. And for that, I truly do love the M cameras. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? I don't know if you guys agree, but it's just something that was playing on my mind a couple days ago. So how on earth then did this camera ruin my YouTube channel? That is a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but when I first picked up this camera, it was all I wanted to use. I didn't want to use my Fuji cameras anymore because it felt like when I was taking them out, it just felt like a bit of a compromise. I wanted to use this thing all of the time. And over here on the channel a couple of years ago, when I picked this thing up, my audience was 90% Fuji and 10% Leica. Every time I made a video with this camera, my views dropped off a cliff. However, I kept using it because I was enjoying it and I stuck true to what I wanted to use. Now we're much closer to a 50-50 split again of what I'm creating here on the channel, and I am finding enjoyment in the X Pro 2 again. However, there was a period where predominantly purchasing this camera and it being my choice of what I wanted to use caused my YouTube views to literally drop off a cliff. So in terms of a conclusion then, I think it should be pretty obvious at this point. I absolutely love this camera. I love using a rangefinder. That's where I get my enjoyment from. And to have a camera that keeps up now with some of the flagship cameras from other companies in terms of image quality, when I get it right, that makes this camera everything I could ever want. It is very expensive. I do think the M10 is probably a better value proposition, but I have no regrets at all. 500 days later, I still love using this thing and I still get excited to take it out on trips. Like, we're going on a few holidays this year and my brain is already thinking about all of the cool images I can get with this camera. So for that, I'm very, very thankful that I picked this up 500 days ago, even though at the time it felt like an absolutely ridiculous financial choice. That's all for this video. If you have enjoyed it, please do not forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And if you've got any comments about anything you've seen in today's video, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that artistic, creative tool piece at the end. Let me know down in the comments. Thank you guys for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.